Now, it's been a turbulent week for the Labour Party and its leadership. Middlesbrough MP Andy MacDonald was suspended on Monday for his speech at a pro-Palestine rally, and there were calls for leader Sir Keir Starmer to resign over his refusal to back a ceasefire in Gaza.
Starmer supported Israel's right to defend itself and pushed for humanitarian pauses in the fighting. Yet, despite holding meetings within his party to address concerns over his position, some feel he has failed to listen sufficiently. We're joined now by legendary news presenter at ITN and GB News, Alastair Stewart. During his tenure as NUS president, Alastair, I think, dealt with some similar problematic supporters. Alastair, how does this compare to your time back then?
Well, one of the problems we had in those days, and always amuses me to remember that Charles Clarke, who went on to be chairman of the Labour Party and Home Secretary and the rest of it, and John Reid were on the NUS executive as well. It was about Northern Ireland, and we had a number of people on the hard left who supported the provisional IRA. And they're the kind of people who Robert Halfon was referring to in education questions the other day as the useful idiots, i.e. they're trying to do the right thing to support civil liberties in Northern Ireland, but they end up supporting a bunch of terrorists. And you'll remember at the time as well, there were pictures of Ken Livingstone, the then mayor of London, and Jeremy Corbyn with IRA supporters. And one of the student leaders at the time turned out to be an active member of the provisional IRA. So useful idiots can be seriously dangerous. And it's an acid test for a party leader, a man who would be prime minister, to get a grip on it. When it's a bunch of undergraduates, that's one thing. When it's councillors that can be counted in their tens and backbenchers and a handful of frontbenchers as well, then I think that Sir Keir Starmer has a very serious problem.
Do you think this is... I was going to say, David Blunkett said, didn't he, last week, that these people are just trying to make themselves better and they need to grow up, very much along the lines of what you're saying there, Alastair?
Well, I've not the first time I've agreed with David Blunkett, who's a very perceptive man, and I knew and worked with him quite a bit when he was the Home Secretary. And I think it is dangerous, and that's what Halfon meant when he talked about useful idiots. They're not just silly children. We used to joke in the NUS days about the trots were, boys and girls whose mummies and daddies either didn't love them quite enough or didn't discipline them properly. If you are pro-Palestinian, that is one thing. If you are in favour of saving lives on all sides, you'd be hard-pressed to find many people who wouldn't agree with that. But if it means that the entire settlement of the 1940s is questioned and you want restoration of Palestine and Palestinian rights, it can only be at the expense of Israel, because there isn't another chunk of land hanging around somewhere on one of my atlases that can be brought in and helped out. That's why people like Sunak and Blinken from the United States of America are trying to reinvigorate the two-state solution, i.e. Palestinians do have their rights and they need to be protected, but so too do Jews and so too does Israel. There's another thing about the hard left which is always worth watching, and it often takes them into great difficulties. And it's that old thing that whoever America likes, the hard left don't like, and whoever America doesn't like, the hard left tend to like. And in my time as a student leader, that got the left into all sorts of problems across Africa, in South America, and in Central America. The left embracing a bunch of people who really were pretty nasty, and they're doing it again with Hamas and Hezbollah.
So, Alastair, this is obviously a big test for Keir Starmer, and there's two ways he can go about this. He can take the view that divided parties don't win elections and therefore try and adjust his position to try and keep his party together, or we could see this as sort of a Neil Kinnock moment with militants in the 1980s, where he feels that he's got to face them down to show the moderate, sort of maybe former Tory voters that he can be trusted. Which would you advise him to do?
Kinnock, Bournemouth, that was the most brilliant speech. P45s being taken round in taxis. I remember that very well. And Derek Hatton and walking out. Do you remember Eric Heffer, who was one of the hard left backbench Tory MPs? There was also Dave Nellis, who was thrown out of the Labour Party, but Heffer wasn't thrown out of the Labour Party. And I think if he doesn't take a grip it will be seen by many people as a sign of leadership. And whether or not you want to vote in your constituency for the Labour man or woman or the Tory or the Lib Dem or whomsoever it may be, or Galloway's back on the scene, isn't he? You know that ultimately what you're voting for is a prime minister and a government, and is a man who cannot control a bunch of councillors over such an important issue the sort of guy that you want representing us at the G7, at NATO, at a whole range of international meetings where you have to really exude confidence and control on behalf of every man and woman in this great country of ours, whether they voted Labour or Tory. That's what's at stake. This is what sort of Prime Minister would Sir Keir Starmer be, and on the global stage. And Davy Lammy, his shadow Foreign Secretary, has showed just how difficult that is in the last few days, getting the line wrong a couple of times.
Alastair Stewart, fantastic seeing you. We want you back on next week and the week after.
We miss you, Alastair, but it's great to see you looking so well. And thank you.
And so fiery and so up for it.
Great to see both of you, and it's a joy to be back. And as I've said to Angelos and Mick, our two lovely bosses, I am available whenever. It's easier to do it from here than it is to come all the way up to London because of my illness.
Well, you're booked for next week. You're booked on our show next week.